All right, welcome everybody to our public information meeting on the Housing and Safety for All plan by the Nashville People's Budget Coalition. It's a pleasure to have you all here. Um, if you have any trouble hearing me or anything like that, let me know. If you have any questions at any time, feel free to add them in the chat. Our member Allie, who is here in the room, will be facilitating the chat a little bit. So if we don't see your question right away, we'll get to it as soon as we can. And with that, we'll go ahead and get started. So, a little bit about what this plan is and about what we're going to do, first of all, today with our time. I'm going to share briefly about the Nashville People's Budget Coalition, going to share briefly about the outreach that we did that got us to this plan that we're proposing. We'll spend a little bit of time on the two main components of our plan, and then we will talk about ways to support it. And there will be Q&A after kind of each component of the plan gets shared. That's what we're going to do over the next 55 minutes or so. So a little bit about the People's Budget Coalition. For those who don't know, we are a member-led organization. Our primary work is around educating and organizing communities in Nashville to create safe and thriving communities, communities that all of us deserve and where we have all of our needs met. And to do so by going beyond traditional public safety institutions for our safety, by increasing investment in life-giving public goods, including housing, above all in many ways. And our work is to radically democratize the way that our city does its business in terms of budgeting and in terms of its governance. So that's a bit about what we do. We started about 5.5 years ago, and typically intervene around the budget cycle. And that is what we're here to present a bit about today, is about our proposal for this current Nashville city operating budget process. So a bit more about that in just a moment. So how we got to this plan, the Housing and Safety for All plan that we're going to share about. Last year, after last budget cycle, we got together as a membership, did some dreaming and visioning and setting of long and short-term goals. And we determined that we have kind of a threefold set of goals as an organization in the short and long term. One, as I mentioned, we want to build direct democracy in Nashville. Two, we want to make sure that there's housing for all and that there's non-police safety for all. Three. So out of that, we developed a campaign plan, and from January until late April, we were engaged in many forms of outreach, including canvassing door to door in mostly North and East Nashville. We held a community assembly. We distributed a survey, which many of you probably completed. We did flyers at events, did texts and calls, all with a special focus on areas that are multiracial and working class in nature, which are areas often where people are most impacted by housing instability and a lack of community safety. So all told, we engaged more than 500 folks one way or another directly. And what we developed out of that, um, in all of that, what we heard very loud and clear is that housing is the number one issue that people are concerned about, which is no surprise for us, as we've been hearing that for as long as we've been an organization and before. And then additionally, that people want greater options when it comes to safety in our communities. So in light of those things rising to the top of the feedback that we heard from people, we developed a plan that, as we will show, is around $1 million total, which is a very small amount when it comes to the whole budget, which is a multi-billion-dollar budget in Nashville. And the two components are, first of all, the Nashville Community Housing Fund, which, as you can see here, would be a self-renewing housing fund that would enable our city to do what it's been saying it wants to do for quite some time, which is to build a significant amount of housing. But this housing would be, by mandate, high quality, permanently affordable, publicly owned, and community governed for low and middle income residents. We'll break down what that means in just a moment. The second piece is the proposal for positions to begin developing a formal Nashville Community Safety Plan. And to be clear, the Nashville People's Budget Coalition has not developed a safety plan for Nashville. We're proposing that we fund positions to engage communities to develop a community safety plan. So as we said, it would be funding for three positions to do some assessment of what already is going on in our city around community safety, and to engage communities to develop a plan that's really centered around meeting people's needs, preventing harm, and having trauma-informed and a situationally appropriate response to the problems that emerge in our communities. So this is our big overview, and we will get a little bit more into it now. And again, at any point, if you have questions, please drop them in the chat. And after the housing section, we'll have some Q&A, and after the safety section, we'll have some Q&A, and we can address those at that point. So first of all, as we said, the total cost is laid out here. It would be just over $1 million. That would be less than around 0.3% of the entire metro operating budget. And for what it's worth, less than 0.5% of the total police budget in Nashville. So what we're asking for, very, very small, but in terms of its impact, very consequential, we believe. Let's get into it a little bit. So to start with, the housing fund, the first part of our plan. Now, the situation that we're in, as I think most of us know, right, is that most elected officials and developers in our city and really across the US believe that housing is not a public good. Rather, it's a commodity. It's a means of profit. And that dynamic is really at the bottom line what creates the present crisis that we're in, where people struggle to find housing, where people die without housing, and so on. And so it's important for us to understand this at the outset here, that our problem is created in large part because of the way that housing is treated as a commodity. And what this proposal says is that we need an approach to housing that actually changes the priority, where people are before profit and where the purpose of housing is actually to house people, not to make money. So we need housing, in short, that removes housing from the private market, because we know that if the private market could solve the issue of people's of a lack of housing and affordable and accessible housing for people, it would have already done so. And so out of that set of understandings and analysis of our situation, we're proposing the Nashville Community Housing Fund. What is it? It is a fund, in short, that would create, as we mentioned, high quality, permanently affordable, publicly owned, meaning the public, as in Metro Nashville owned, and community governed housing for low and middle income residents. This quickly is an example of this framework and approach to housing that goes under the notion of social housing. Social housing is housing that is owned by community-based nonprofits or municipalities, that's permanently removed from the private market and therefore permanently affordable by mandate, that is community controlled, meaning that tenants and impacted community members play a role in determining how resources are allocated and how properties are governed. They're high quality. There are protections for tenants that go beyond what most tenant protections policies in cities like Nashville or states like Tennessee allow. And it's a model that's been extremely successful around the world. The flagship model of social housing is in Vienna, Austria, where more than half of all residents of that city live in publicly financed, publicly owned housing that is deeply affordable. Montgomery County, Maryland is another place that is pursuing a model of social housing that's been successful. Austin, Atlanta, Seattle are some of the more recent cities that are working on this as well. And it's worth noting that the recently released Unified Housing Strategy, put out by the Housing Division under the Planning Department in Metro Nashville government, does in fact recommend this approach to housing. However, it lists it as a medium range goal, meaning that in about 3 to 5 years, they'd like to pursue this. Our premise is that we can't afford to wait any longer. to create housing that remains permanently affordable and that actually meets the need. And so that's why we are pushing for it now. So a bit about how the financing works. I will share a little bit about this, and then in a moment, we'll ask two expert partners who have been supportive in the process of developing this proposal, who are here with us today, Kay Bowers and Andy Zhu, to say a word or two about how this is different from other models that we currently utilize in Nashville, and to say maybe another word or two about this. But to start with, and again, feel free to drop any questions that you have in the chat. The way that this gets financed is that Metro would issue between 50 and $100 million in bonds. Bonds are a complicated financial mechanism that maybe Kay or Andy can speak to more if there's questions about it. But it's a way that cities often fund big public goods and public interest projects of various kinds, including you may have heard about a stadium or a transit plan. These are things where bonds have been used to create the financing to provide the goods and services that improve people's lives. We do not currently do this in any substantial way for housing, and this is a push for us to do so. So the proceeds from the bonds would fund low interest construction loans to developer partners that are aligned with the kind of the policies that are set in stone by this fund. As we mentioned, the UHS report recommends this approach to unified housing strategy, as well as the recent Imagine Nashville report that came out earlier this year, later last year, I forget when, recommends this approach to housing. The housing itself would be mixed income. Developers would construct this housing with both market rate and deeply affordable units that would be made possible through a cross-subsidization model where higher income tenants help subsidize the rents essentially of the lower income tenants. So rental rates would not exceed 30% of tenants' pre-tax income. 30% of one's income is the kind of marker at which, if it's over that, you say that you're cost burdened traditionally. And so it would stay under that. And we would base this on Davidson County area median income as opposed to the kind of regional area median income that the city often uses. And the goal would be for it to be a third, a third, a third of these area median income ranges so that the lowest income would have a third, kind of the next one up would have a third, and then more of the regular market rate units above that. So it would be housing that would ideally be, places where community could be built across class lines in really mutually edifying ways. So the fund itself would exist as an independent entity, meaning it would not be like in the mayor's office. It would not be um, a new Metro department per se, but it would be in partnership with Metro government and financed through Metro government. It would administer the loans through the Metro issued bonds to build the housing. So now the fund itself, and this is what we're proposing for this budget year, fiscal year 2026, which is what the council will vote on in mid-June, which will be in effect from July to July of the next fiscal year. The cost of setting up the fund with three staff members and all the other things needed would be the $540,000 figure. Once established, the city would pay anywhere between $4 to $8 million annually in debt service on the bonds that were issued. So it would be a pretty low cost, especially considering the higher cost of other housing interventions that we have currently, and therefore is a model that I think is attractive on that level. As noted, the ownership of the housing would remain under Metro. These would be constructed on publicly owned land and would be brought under a community land trust to ensure permanent affordability of the land and of the housing. Technically, I think Tennessee allows 99 years, and so we would try to build in mechanisms for it to be permanent beyond that as well. But that's what the state law is. So this is essentially permanent decommodification, taking housing off of the private market in order for it to maintain its affordability. You wouldn't be worrying about it being sold out from under you. You would have that kind of guarantee of long-term affordability. And the way that the funding would work is that we use this term self-renewing, or kind of self-renewing is probably the best term. But the equity gained from the loan and rental payments would revolve back into the fund to produce more housing. So whereas in the private market, um, money that's put in to creating affordable housing ends up being channeled to private entities of some kind, whether that's individuals or developers or corporate entities. And so the public investment is rerouted towards the private, whereas in this case, the public investment, all the returns made on that public investment would go back into making more housing, which is not what we currently do in our city. And this would allow us to not have to rely on private investment, on soon to be disappearing federal grants, or on additional huge expenditures from the operating budget annually. So in that way, is a fairly attractive model, I think, for people who are concerned about the financial aspect of it. I would like to invite now Andy Zhu to start with, who is a local developer who is an advocate for this model of housing and other models as well, to say a word about how this approach differs from other models that we currently use in Nashville.
Yes, and sorry, I'm trying to get my thing situated here. Hey everyone, this is Andy Zhu with MFX Ventures. We do a lot of affordable housing work and thinking through how to structure these projects to make them happen, especially working with the government. And I think I wanted to highlight what Andrew was saying about the sustainability and the appeal of this as sustainability. You compare and the longevity. It's sustainability and longevity of this type of process. Because currently, Andrew mentioned, we let the private market essentially dictate everything about how housing is built in our country, and we may have things like the low income tax credit program, LIHTC. So why is this different from LIHTC? Well, first, when you get a low income tax credit, essentially what the federal government says, Mr. Developer, because you're building this building and you're going to restrict some of these units to people making this income, I'm going to give you some tax credits in return for building that building, which is great. And it's good to have that, and it's better than nothing. But one of the issues with the LIHTC program, or the low income tax credit program is often referred to as LIHTC, LIHTC. One of the problems with that program is that it's actually only affordable for 15 years, which is a surprise, I think, to many people when they learn about LIHTC and these tax credits, because you build a $100 million building, you might get $30–40 million in tax credits. And it's better to have that housing than nothing. I'm not trying to say that LIHTC is not a good thing. It's better than nothing. But at the end of 15 years, that project can go right back to market rate housing. And at that point in time, it's probably in a developer's incentive, if they've held on to the building for 15 years, to flip it to market rate, because all of a sudden you could raise those rents 200, 300, 400, $500 a month. And so and I think for most people, hearing that 15 years is not a long time to keep something affordable, especially when we're putting that amount of subsidy into that. And I think that's one of the other potential issues with the Barnes Fund as it is currently structured, and there may be some reforms coming. But as the Barnes Fund is currently structured, it's only affordable for 30 years, the projects that get Barnes Fund money, as opposed to what Andrew is describing, 99 years plus. And I think the major issue with the Barnes Fund is that it's just a grant from a financial sustainability perspective. The city says, hey, every year I'm going to give out $15 or $20 million in direct grants to a developer, to an investment group. And because of that, hey, we're going to restrict some of the units for 30 years, which is good. But again, from a financial sustainability point, it's difficult. The cool thing about this fund, and Andrew mentioned, hey, we're going to issue $100 million in bonds, but that's not $100 million a year. It's what he mentioned. It's $4 to $8 million in interest payments annually. And what this fund allows us to do is instead of going to the developer and saying, I'm just going to give you a grant in order for you to build me some affordable housing, you go to the developer and say, I'm going to give you this as a low interest rate loan, and you're going to actually pay me most of that interest payment back. So it may cost Metro on the top end $4 million to $8 million a year, but we're also going to be charging the developer to use that money every single year. And why that might be valuable to the developer is because this fund comes in essentially how a building is built is that you have a developer says, I want to build something. They go out and raise private equity, right? And then they get a construction loan from a bank. And so the construction loan gives them some amount of money from a bank. And then you have private equity who comes in, and the private equity groups say, I want a 20% return on my money on average. That's the cost to put in private equity to go develop a building. And so if you have $100 million building, for the equity portion of that, those people need a 20% return. So they might need, of that $100 million building cost, $10 million of that is profit that needs to go to pay the equity investor. When you have a fund like this, and it says the city says, I want to invest instead. Now we're charging the developer to use our funds, but we're charging them 4, 5, 6, 7, 8% interest as opposed to 20% return that the equity needs. And because of that, we can make the building and use, instead of taking those proceeds as money to Metro's pocket or to this organization, this new entity's pocket, that extra cost savings is translated into more affordable units. And that's kind of the golden promise of this. And as Andrew mentioned, it's being done in a lot of cities around America right now at very, very low cost annually, because it is the public sector and Metro and us all collectively saying, we want to invest in this as a city, but instead of charging 20% really high returns, our returns are going to come from paying our debt interest and creating more affordable units. And that's why this as a program is so appealing compared to LIHTC that we have to wait for the federal government for, and they expire in 15 years, which is not going to help us ever get ahead of the problem. Or from the Barnes Fund as it is today, which is giving out grants, that's just direct money that has to come out of the budget every single year. This is something that can be originated one time and starts to pay for itself over time. Andrew, hopefully that was helpful additional context.
Thank you, Andy. Kay, do you want to have a quick word or two? We'll maybe keep it to maybe 2 minutes if we can, then we'll have more chance after.
Yeah, I think Andy hit on the primary benefits of it. I'll just remind people, when it comes to our money as a public, our tax money that we're paying, sales taxes or property taxes that goes into Metro's revenue, our money is used in a way that promotes good stewardship. It doesn't just flow out the door. Our money is an investment that revolves, and it helps us actually create more affordable housing projects and bring more units to the market faster. That's priority one. Priority two is this model differs from LIHTC in that it allows us to move faster and bring units to closure and get them built and get people housed much, much faster than the cumbersome and very expensive model of the low-income housing tax credit program. It's more expensive to use. You end up spending more money towards the cost of the units, and it takes much more time, and there's never enough of it. If it's fine for it to continue, but instead of using outside investors, we become the investors. We have to look at ourselves that way. We, the public, are the investors, and we're saying, here's this model. And if you set it up right as a mixed income model, you don't have to rely on outside monies to keep it operating, because it's a mixed income. You have a mix of market rate units compared with units that serve the bulk of our workers in Nashville, from the low to the middle income household. And I'll stop there, Andrew, and let you take it.
Thank you, Andy and Kay. We really appreciate that information and that framing. So let me wrap up this housing section and then open it up for some questions. So to kind of build upon what both Andy and Kay said, this question of why this now, as opposed to later, and why this model is useful for us now. So first of all, as we've said, this model sidesteps the major uncertainties of federal funding. The current presidential administration has threatened to gut housing and urban development, which would create major problems, and we are going to feel that in Nashville and everywhere in the US very soon. And with that, the volatility, the unpredictability of the private housing market, once again, it's structurally incapable and unwilling to address this problem of a lack of accessible and affordable housing in any meaningful way. As such, this model and this approach would insulate this new affordable housing that's created from the risks of displacement that come from the expiring limits on affordability, whether it's 15 and 30 years, or if there's not any limit on it, landlords can come in and this happens all the time. Corporate landlords come in and up the price, double the price. People have nowhere to go. This is happening all across our city all the time. And so this would sidestep that and insulate the housing from those vulnerabilities of the current way of doing housing. It would also proactively reduce the severity that we know is coming of the impending rise of housing insecurity and homelessness that is very much on the horizon and looming. And so we don't need to be waiting 5 years to do something like this. We need to be doing it now. And lastly, as we noted, the city and city partners have already recommended this as an approach. I will say what we're hearing from the city and from Metro Finance and others is what little we have heard is essentially we're thinking about it, but we're in the early stages of that, which sounds to us kind of like maybe eventually. That doesn't mean we have to stop when they say that. We're going to continue to push for this through this budget cycle and see what happens. But that is a bit about some of the reasons. And we kind of have gone over this, so I'll just be quick on this. This has been highlighted by Andy and Kay. No major expenditures every year, recycles all the equity back into the housing, and it gets us close to this goal that the private market truly will never achieve of building 90,000 affordable units that stay affordable over the next decade. So let's pause now and open it up to any questions that folks might have. Let's see. So we have some from Craig in the chat already. So Craig is asking, is the proposal to fund the projects with revenue bonds more expensive or GO, general obligation bonds? Kay or Andy, would you be willing to speak to that?
Yeah, I think the idea with that, these would be GO bonds, but instead of like having it rely on an unknown income stream of maybe we have ticket sales in the future, right? Or et cetera. Essentially, they're funded through GO bonds at our metro interest borrowing level. And then because of that, we can charge it out to a developer at equivalently the same number. And that way it's as net revenue neutral as possible, maybe minus some administrative costs.
Right. Thank you. And then the second question from Craig is, he says, the Vienna model makes residents available to 80% of the population. One of the big problems with public housing as we have it is anti-Blackness in public policy, or more palatably, maybe the undeserving poor idea. The Vienna model takes on this issue by making the housing more widely available. Do we have thoughts about limiting the housing to low and middle income residents? Andy, okay, would you like to speak to that as well?
Um, well, one of our challenges in the US is trying, we can't, it's very, very difficult, to follow exactly the Vienna model because our systems are set up so very differently. At one time, people may not know this, but at one time, public housing was and had guidelines that allowed you to serve incomes up into middle income households. And then that changed. But at one time, that was actually the case. And then we got away from this. So also in Austria, there's considerable public dollars that flow from the state to, for example, the city of Vienna, to acquire lands and help it build more housing, so it doesn't have to generate everything itself. So we're in the U.S. and we have a different system. So this is why Montgomery County, Maryland, the folks in Montgomery County, Maryland, began to think, well, we have to think a little differently about the economics of operating and paying the bills long term to take care of the building and the units and pay the insurance long term. So what would the financing model look like to help us do that? And this is why Montgomery County, Maryland, which I think decided to take this approach, combining a percentage of the units for market rate with percentage to serve the lower income households. And we know that's where the greatest need is. We all agree on that. So, Andy, I don't know if you have anything else to add.
Yeah, I would just add to that, and I think this kind of blends into Lindsay's question too about in the mixed income model, how many units would be for folks in the 0 to 60% AMI category. So I think for public support, as much as possible, those market rate units, we definitely want some of those in here. And also that's part of the financial sustainability part, which tries to answer Lindsay's question of how many could be below 60%. Developer talk depends on the deal. But I think the reality is each project is going to have to be, we're going to have to make trade-offs in each project, right? If we're trying to make it self-sustaining of, if we want this project to have a substantial number of people, 50% AMI or below, 40% or below, we'll probably need more market rate units in that building just to kind of offset and try to blend it that way. But I think it can be open to each project and kind of corresponding to maybe what this local demographic needs versus another one.
Yeah, but it also, other factors could help reduce the cost. Like, for example, if it's built on existing public land, you don't have to go buy land. If you're able to get property tax abatements, then all that saves cost, which can then be passed on to the renters in the forms of lower rents. So Andy's right, it depends on each individual project, as we call it, or deal, as they say in that world, what the economics look like and how can you set it up for sustainability, economic sustainability, where you have buildings taken care of, insurance is being paid, tenants treated fairly. It depends on each individual project.
And I will say that I think we've put down that we aspire to a kind of 30, 30, 30, or like third model of like 0 to 60, 60 to 80, 80 to 120. But that may, it probably will depend upon each one. But what I think there's agreement upon here is that we don't want this to be just, like 90% market rate and
Mhm.
10% deeply affordable.
No,
That's
no.
not the approach that we want in this. Yeah. Adam's question, would site selections prioritize locations near other community needs such as food, jobs, and transit access? Yes, I think that this is something that we've discussed as well and would want to be encouraged to be part of the ongoing conversation in the creation of something like this. I know that Stand Up Nashville and other groups have been pushing for housing along the transit corridors, and I do know that, for those who didn't see um, the Choose How You Move plan was brought to court, and it was the courts ruled in the favor of the city and the mayor who passed the plan, with the exception of being able to use Choose How You Move funds for housing. And so I think that does highlight the need for that housing to still be built along those corridors. And so I hope that this would be something that would allow us to do that as well. Lindsay's next question about could units accept housing choice vouchers like Section 8 or Shelter Plus Care, Andy or Kay?
Oh yeah, that would not be an
Yeah.
issue.
Yeah, if they're around, those are federal programs.
They're around.
But yes.
And it probably would not just be could it accept, it would, like, in all these things, transit priorities, AMI priorities, food access priorities, voucher priorities, like I would imagine that this would something that we mandate, like the project to accept is to accept Section 8 vouchers. Not to say that every unit is going to have one, right? But I would think that this is something that we would be seriously focused on. It's like, okay, we want to set this up. They have to accept them. Whether or not they come to the property is a different question.
We have two more quick questions. If we could try to answer them as quickly as we can so we can get to our next section of our presentation. But from Jane, the $4 to $8 billion figure of the annual debt service, does that go on forever as the housing ages and needs more maintenance and maybe less attractive to middle income people? Will it still be self-sustaining?
Yeah,
Well, that's $1 million, not B with the billion.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. Million, not billion. Yeah.
And bonds are paid off. Bonds have a term, and so eventually they're paid off. And depending on the bonds and the term for the bonds, that debt goes away.
Mm-hmm.
That debt goes away.
Mm-hmm.
So if we, for example, if we issued $100 million and we had to pay 8% interest to the person, because it's an outside investor essentially who gives us that bond money as a city, right? And they say, I need you to pay me 8% on that money every year. That 8% number is closer to what the number would be, including the principal payback. So that would mean at the end of, let's just say it's a 20-year term. At the end of that 20-year term, that $100 million we borrowed, including paying that 8% number, including some of that principal payback, would essentially be, we, just like your mortgage, you paid down your mortgage. At the end of the thing, you still own your asset. We would have had borrowed $100 million. We paid it down. We have $100 million. Then now we can just lend out. And that number and those units that we do 20 years from now using that pot of money, we can be lending that money out at 0%, 1% interest. And then because of that, we already have the money, it's just a pot of money sitting around. And then that allows us to build way more 30% units or 50% AMI units. So the answer is to that, for each individual bond, it's not necessarily going to last forever, but like I think our argument would be, as we can show how sustainable this model is, given that other governments are doing it here and abroad, you would probably increase issuing the bond issuance over time. Like Montgomery County started with just 50 million. Then they said, this is going really well, we're going to double it. And they're probably going to put out another set within the next few years because it keeps going well. So that would be, I think, the idea. Yeah. And to the maintenance point, we would make sure that the underwriting has enough maintenance budget in there to upkeep with the units sustainably without needing additional subsidy, which is the key, right? A lot of
Yes.
affordable housing is underwritten, assuming that another grant program is going to have to come in. We would need to underwrite these to say, hey, we don't want to rely on other grant programs, and barring surprise tariff, COVID surprise sort of thing, this is what our budget can sustain to keep these buildings up. That's what we would try to make sure that happens.
Yes, thank you. And quickly on this, these other remaining questions, I'll try to answer them quickly and then we'll move on. And I'll ask Andy and Kay if I get something wrong here if you wouldn't mind responding in the chat just so that we can move on to the next thing after. But we are not proposing here to move funds currently in Barnes to this model. This is just a proposal for a new model. We are not proposing that this go under Barnes because we know this is something entirely different. And so as of right now, we're not proposing a shift of funds, though just to highlight that some Barnes funds did go to the project that Andy was involved in, that the Southeast Center for Cooperative Development was involved in creating this limited equity cooperative housing project, which is coming online here soon. So shout out to the folks working on that. And then Stacy's question. In terms of enforcement with landlords and stuff like that, the landlords would be either Metro or a Metro contracted entity, and it would be written in as a mandate that that all of this would apply to the rents and to the affordability. So this is all going to stay under Metro's control more closely, and so we wouldn't theoretically be running into the issue of it not being enforced by random landlords because we're not going to have it's not giving out monies to this or that landlord. It's kind of keeping it in-house more or less. And so we would ideally be able to avoid some of those vulnerabilities in other places. Andy, okay, if you want to add in the chat anything else about that I miss in response to those questions, feel free. Thanks all for questions. You feel free to email us with other questions that you may have, but for the sake of time, we're going to move into the next piece. Just a heads up, we may go to about 2:15 or so, since we're going a little bit long with such excellent questions and important ones to respond to. Also want to note that Allie has put in the chat there a great resource from the Alliance for Housing Justice, which lays out in a lot of detail what social housing is all about and how it can meet the need in this moment. All right, so moving on to the next portion of our proposal. This is the Housing and Safety for All proposal, right? Housing and safety don't typically go hand in hand in a lot of the public discourse around these things, but for us, we understand safety as much larger than police and jails and courts. And to us, safety means something a lot different, which we'll talk about in a moment. But it includes housing. Housing is a matter of safety. If people are housed, communities are safer. Individuals who are housed are safer. We're all better off when more people are housed in our communities. And if we understand housing simply as a public good, a human right, then it's unacceptable to even, be casually okay with the idea that thousands of people will be without it. We don't treat education largely, depends on who the we is, but traditionally municipalities like our own have treat education and transit and other things like public goods that all people deserve to have real access to. And so we want to treat housing the same way, which we believe increases safety. So community safety plan proposal. This is a proposal, as we said, to fund 3 positions that would do 3 things primarily. 1, assess what's going on in our city right now when it comes to community safety. And I will define community safety in just a moment. 2, it would explore opportunities to expand our local community safety ecosystem. And 3, it would engage impacted communities and advocates to develop an official Nashville Community Safety Plan rooted in 3 things: the provision of public goods. So safety is not just a reaction when something bad happens. It's talking about And when we're assessing what's going on with safety, we're assessing where are people's needs being met and not met. And therefore prevention, secondly, and thirdly, trauma-informed response that is situationally appropriate to the need that's arising in a community. So the safety plan would outline the city's approach to allocating resources and energies and policy direction under this framework, as opposed to our current framework, which is often under the title of public safety, which in most people's minds refers to police and courts and first response and kind of essentially reaction after a bad thing has already happened. So you just think about the logistics, the timeline of our current model. Something bad happens, somebody gets hurt, someone takes something like that happens in the community, a call is made, someone comes, if they come at all, a while later. And then a process happens of taking someone out of the community potentially, caging them potentially, and other kinds of responses. So it doesn't go upstream to prevent or deal with the problems that create harm. Rather, it reacts to them in a very reactionary way. So we understand community safety as a condition of social well-being. That's much broader than just react when a bad thing happens. It's a condition of well-being for all, built upon public goods that are fully funded and practices that prevent harm by guaranteeing equitable access to all the things that people need to thrive. And that also do respond when harm inevitably still happens by de-escalating conflict and by meeting residents' needs, which are diverse needs in the process. So you can see, I think, that this is a very different model than the current predominant approach to so-called public safety, which is reactionary. This is more in terms of prevention and a response that's nuanced and thoughtful and diverse depending on the situation, as opposed to a one-size-fits-all, a person with a badge and a gun shows up for every single problem in our community. So how this would work, as we said, this would be, again, 3 positions that we're proposing. By the way, we are proposing that these positions be funded um, to live within the Metro Human Relations Commission, which, as far as we're concerned, is one of the only, maybe the only long-standing, reliable Metro department with great integrity in terms of how it operates and what its concerns and its purpose are. And so we believe it's an ideal place to kind of hold these positions that would start with the assessment of what's going on. So under the guidance of a task force that would be created, that would have great representation from directly impacted people, people who are frontline advocates and organizers in the work of creating community safety, as well as reps from Metro departments and policy experts. They would guide um, the process of assessing what's already going on that fits under the rubric of community safety as defined above. So it would be kind of a landscape analysis of what we currently have and what gaps there are in what we currently have. In light of that, we would be able to identify opportunities to expand our community safety ecosystem under the guidance of that task force, the guiding body, to identify those gaps and to outline opportunities to grow the ecosystem of community safety practices and programs and entities. This would also thoroughly include, from the beginning, great community outreach and participation to identify the problems, the needs, and the possible solutions as understood by community members, particularly those most impacted by a lack of community safety. So traditionally, when things like this get brought into the Metro government process for consideration, a plan is made behind closed doors. It's finalized, and then they cart it out to a podium or to a presentation or a screen to say, "Hey, community, what do you think about this?" And then you hear some feedback, you make it seem like input has been given, and then you proceed regardless of what the feedback was. This is not the approach that this should take and that we are going to advocate for to happen. Rather, community would be engaged on the front end in thorough ways that are really tried and true ways of engaging community members in meaningful ways so that they are active agents in shaping the outcome of all of this. And then lastly, this would lead to the implementation through the synthesis of all this listening and all of the assessment and all of the outlining of possible areas of growth. This would lead to the creation of a community safety plan that would lay out a blueprint that should be understood as a living blueprint of sorts that would coordinate the existing local efforts. So a number of things are already in place in Nashville. A number of important community organizations and nonprofits do really important violence interruption and restorative justice work. There's the new Office of Youth Safety. There are a number of existing efforts, but they're not really held in any kind of coordination of any kind. Not that they have to be tightly held together, but there's no one who even looks and says, what do we have that fits under this approach to safety? Two, this plan would expand the effective local strategies that we have and build upon them. And also three, establish new practices and new programs through a long-term commitment to evidence-based, community-rooted violence prevention and safety, which again is a very different, completely different approach from our current approach to so-called public safety in our city, which does not yield the safety that people deserve, and that in fact, in many ways, creates more vulnerability and danger for people. And so this is the basics of this proposal. And again, it's not a plan that the People's Budget Coalition has made. Our proposal is that we gather the right people to engage communities to develop that plan with communities. So why this now? If it's not already obvious, there's been a lot of talk recently in the context of Metro's recent push for increased police surveillance technology, which have largely failed. The People's Budget Coalition is proud to have been part of the efforts to slow those things down, as well as the recent mass ICE raids in Southeast Nashville and in the area more broadly. There's been a lot of conversation in the context of those conversations where community members and advocates and even some council members have raised the issue of the need for a community safety plan that transcends the limits of our traditional public safety models. So it's on people's minds right now. Federal budget cuts are going to threaten all kinds of infrastructure that supports community well-being and therefore community safety, which almost inevitably will lead to greater forms of vulnerability, which can be tied into certain kinds of harm in the years ahead. We can be pretty sure that we will see this coming down the pike. Metro does not currently coordinate anything related to community safety, as we said, or violence prevention for residents of all ages. The Office of Youth Safety that's coming online that has a new director, and Dr. Phyllis Hildreth will do this work for youth within a certain age range, but not all residents. And so the Office of Youth Safety would be thought of as a partner in this work very much. This approach would, and this is one way to put it, that I think could make sense to a lot of ears that would hear it, is that this approach would help reduce what are currently unrealistic expectations placed upon our current institutions that go under the title public safety. You'll even often hear police or police chiefs themselves say things like, the public asks us to do too much. Like, we're not equipped to do all these things we're being asked to do. And in a way, that is true, in that police have become the go-to response for almost every problem that arises in our communities. And we also have an issue of um, perpetual vacancies in the police department. People don't want to become police at the rates that they used to, and people who do become police often leave after a shorter period of time than they used to. So this would be a way of channeling resources to, in one way of putting it, relieve the pressures placed upon the current institutions. That is one way that we could talk about it. And lastly, this would be less than half a percent of the current public safety budget. Actually, that's just the police budget. If you include the courts and the jails, it would be even less than that. This is a tiny amount of money, but it would help us create a community-informed, community-shaped vision for how to approach safety in this city that doesn't just limit the notion of safety to you respond with a gun after a bad thing happens. We deserve more than that. And so that is the premise behind this. So at this point, we can open it up to any questions that folks might have about this proposal. And then after that point, we will move on to some closing things. So any questions, feel free to put them in the chat, or if you want to come off mute, if you have one, you're welcome to do that as well. We can take this as that this was extremely clear. Let's see what we have. Thank you, Lindsay. Um,
Well,
any,
I'll jump in,
yes,
Andrew.
please.
Um, are there other models and other communities for this kind of work that you've looked to build out this plan?
Yes, thank you for that, Kay. This is a growing edge in policy around these issues that is starting to take off more as we speak. There are a couple of cities that have approached this. One is Durham, North Carolina, which created a Department of Community Safety that takes a similar approach and that has some kind of non-police first responder programs that they developed there, and different things like that. There are some other cities that have swung big on this, but didn't ultimately make contact with the ball, to use a baseball metaphor, including Minnesota, Minneapolis, Minnesota, which a few years ago tried to actually replace their police department with a community safety department, that ultimately failed on the ballot, but by a very narrow margin. But there's a great appetite for it. Ali, if you could share too in the chat the resource around community safety agenda, which is developed by some national groups, including the Movement for Black Lives and some others, that kind of charts out a vision of how this can look at a city municipal level, and even state and federal level as well. And so there have also been some proposed legislation at the federal level, including the Breathe Act, which is included in that report that Ali links, and some others that have tried to implement this approach to safety at a larger level, which have not yet been successful at the legislative sense. And then there may be a handful of other cities that are escaping my mind right now, but it's a kind of it's still in its infancy in a way, but we're hoping to build the momentum that's already emerging across the country here in Nashville. Let me see. Yeah, thank you so much, everybody. Okay, so if there's no other questions now, if you have some, feel free to put them in the chat as we're wrapping up. One last thing that I wanted to share is that in the course of our outreach, people who we talked to had a lot of things that they think would improve their communities. And so we wanted to include this as a kind of an addendum to our primary twofold proposal, that we want a budget that increases funding for all of these things. So these are listed in order of preference as in terms of how much they were mentioned with people that we interacted with in the course of our outreach. But we feel that it's important that that these things be funded and funded well. And some of them will likely have some increases, some others might not. But we wanted to be sure to represent what people shared with us in the course of our outreach. Okay, so excuse me, to wrap up, I'm going to list off a couple of these ways to support this platform and this plan, and Allie will drop some links in the chat for you to make it easy. First, we do have a petition that is for individuals to fill out, and you can go to the link there. It has a letter to the mayor and Metro Council about this plan and why we think it's important that it be incorporated into the budget. If you are part of an organization that would like to endorse this plan, we will be publishing organizations that have endorsed it on our social media and website over the course of the coming weeks. So if you are part of an organization that might consider that, you can go to that link to learn more about it. We are going to have, leading up to an item further down this list, the June 3rd public hearing is a very important night where community members can come out and spend 2 minutes talking to Metro Council about what they want to see in the final operating budget that will pass on June 17th, probably. So in preparation for that, we're hosting a public comment workshop / general interest meeting on May 29th on Zoom. We'll release registration information about that tomorrow on our socials and maybe email. So follow us on socials and email, which is the next thing down, to make sure you're in the loop. But that workshop will be a time for us to come together with folks who want to come out and lift up these things that we're pushing for, but to do so in very personalized, narrative-based ways, because those are often the more compelling presentations at council. We always hear from council members that, they want to hear about the actual impacts on people's lives that proposals would have, as opposed to just a repetition of the same words coming from like a fact sheet or something. So we will be helping people think through how they can share on June 3rd to council, which is an important time to have your voice heard and to potentially shape the outcome of the final budget. And by the way, for those who don't know, the mayor has proposed his budget. Now it's the turn of the council to propose a substitute, which will make what ultimately amount to very small changes to the mayor's budget, but sometimes more substantial or at least impactful changes. And so our target now is for Metro Council to incorporate what we're proposing into their substitute budget to be voted on June 17th. And that's the timeline. Soon we will be posting about an opportunity for folks to share either with an audio recording or of a selfie video of some kind, of 30 seconds or so of how the plan would improve your life or the life of people in your community. So we want to find lots of voices who want to speak to how this would improve their lives and share that as part of the greater voice pushing for this. We'll also be canvassing, excuse me, door to door, as well as some phone and text banking throughout the next couple of weeks of May and into June, beyond June 3rd, up to June 17th. So if you want to join us out in your neighborhood or another neighborhood, or if you want to join us on the phone or a text banking operation, sign up will also be coming for that in the next day or two. We'll also have sign up soon to join us on June 3rd. The meeting starts at 6:30. We'll probably gather more like 5 or 5:30, and the hearing itself will start close to 7. If we're there sooner rather than later, we can get in line earlier and be out of there earlier, because this meeting, the hearing itself, will likely go until maybe at the earliest 8:30, but probably more likely 9:30 or 10:30 at night. And then lastly, if you could share about our plan, we've got some posts and videos. We've got some more coming in the next couple of days, breaking down our platform and proposed plan. Share those in your communities, share them with your faith communities, whatever associations or organizations you're part of. And if you have any questions at all, you can email us at any time or DM us on one of our platforms. And we would love to answer whatever questions we have, talk about ways to partner, hear about what your organization is working on and ways that we can maybe engage in some mutual support. But I think that is it for now. So many, many thanks to all of you for coming out. We will, assuming this gets the file all downloads correctly, we will have a recording of this that we can share and that you can then share with others. So thank you again, and I hope you'll stay in touch as we push for this to be incorporated in the budget. Thanks, y'all. Thanks to Kay and Andy and